In part 2 of the talk, I briefly mentioned that culture shapes universal and innate moral foundations, and I mentioned that narratives are deeply intertwined with morality. In this part of the talk, Fritz Breithaupt will describe some of our work on morality and narratives.
It is time to give John a little pause. This is Fritz speaking. I want to take up the last point that John just made when he mentioned the differences that people often have about moral issues. And I want to throw in a different aspect to this question, namely the question of narrative. And I want to ask whether narratives can also have something to do with our differences that we have in moral decisions. So I want to ask the basic questions, what it means that we usually resort to little stories when we talk about moral decisions. We usually tell the event, convey this to other people, and hope or assume that they would come to a similar verdict as we would. It is, of course, absolutely fascinating to see what people make out of the same kind of sequence of events and how people derive very different judgments about the very same kind of story of events. Now, one way to account for this is to assume that it is the people who are the driver of difference. Different people are different, they have different cultural backgrounds, they may have a different distribution of these moral foundations John introduced via Jonathan Haidt, and so therefore, of course, they're more likely to notice different things in the story. However, there's also another way to account for the difference in moral judgment, which is to look at the little story that drives the different judgments. Could it be that people react to different versions of the same sequence of events in different ways? So that the narrative presentation mode of the very same kind of events could drive different verdicts in different people. If our new culprit as the driver of difference in moral judgments is narrative, then we of course have to ask what narratives are. And for some people, narratives are simply a sequence of events that are always exactly the same. And certainly, the sequence of events are an important of the narratives. However, there's something else. There is this way that we try to make sense of stories, the way that we think that there's something at stake in the story that matters, that is not yet resolved. This is a point that Jerome Bruner made when he wanted to account for what narratives are. And I only read to you the part that is highlighted in red here. The point of narrative is to resolve the unexpected, to settle the auditor's doubt, or in some manner to redress or explicate the imbalance that prompted the telling of the story in the first place. A story then has two sides: a sequence of events and an applied evaluation of the events recounted. I think Bruner is onto something here. A story is not simply the basic course of events, X happened and then Y happened, but it also triggers the auditor, the listener, the reader to think about the story, to make sense of it, to add an evaluation to it, to doubt what happened, or to give a different meaning to the very kind of same story that one just listened to or just heard. That is, the resolution of the story not given with a sequence of events, but is some cognitive labor that we add to the story. But that is still part of the very narrative thinking that is triggered by the story. So building on Bruner and people who study narratives, narratologists, our working hypothesis is that this process of making sense of a story involves creating competing interpretations of it, different versions of it. And so we define narrative thinking as a reader's or listener's cognitive process of considering different interpretations or versions of one account of actions. Put differently, each story comes in many versions. And that is important to us, that a basic telling of the events automatically includes many ways to make sense of it, many versions of it. Now, don't want to go into all the complications of this relationship of the basic course events and these many versions that come along with it. But I want to drive our question back to the question of morality here and want to ask whether this plurality of versions, the multi-versionality of it, could be accounting for the difference that we often find in moral judgments. Put more blatantly, which conflicts do narratives produce? There are, of course, a lot of possible candidates that could drive this multi-versionality of stories, and I'm just listing just a few of here to give you an idea here. People can relate to different perspectives of a story. They can identify with more than one person in a story and then experience or see the whole situation differently. There can be different forms of frames, predictions that people make, preferences that come into it, suspense, and so on and so on and so on. I think the list for those kind of means is much longer than I even want to indicate here. In the case of what we'll look at here, we'll only focus on one of these potential differences.
Please proceed now to part 4b.